Please, don't make us do this. The woman clutched her child tighter as panic spread through the crowd. Around her, hundreds of people stood frozen in fear. Some were crying, some were praying, others stared in silence, unable to believe what was happening. Then, a voice echoed through the loudspeakers. It's too late now. Deep in the jungles of Guyana, a community that had crossed an ocean searching for paradise was living its final hours. Mothers held their children, families whispered desperate goodbyes, and the man they had trusted with their lives stood before them, demanding one final act of loyalty. By the next morning, more than 900 people would be dead. How did a dream of hope become one of the darkest tragedies in modern history? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Back before the jungle. Back before the fear. Back before the world learned the name. Jonestown. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Wanted to Be God. Long before he became one of the most feared cult leaders in history, Jim Jones was simply a strange child growing up in a rural Indiana. He was born in 1931 during the Great Depression. America was struggling, families were poor, jobs were scarce. The future looked uncertain. Jones spent much of his childhood alone, and neighbors later recalled an unusual boy, quiet, intense, and deeply obsessed with religion. But there was something unsettling about him. While other children played outside, Jim spent hours inside churches, not because he simply believed, but because he was watching, studying, observing. He paid attention to everything: how preachers raised their voices, how crowds responded, how fear and hope could move people in seconds, how faith could be shaped like a tool. One neighbor later said, "He didn't look like he was listening to the sermon. He looked like he was studying the people." Even as a child, Jim Jones was fascinated by control. He would often gather other children and imitate preachers, standing on makeshift stages in backyards or empty lots. He would raise his hands and shout sermons with unnatural confidence. "Listen to me," young Jim would say. "You must listen, because I speak the truth." The other children would laugh at first, thinking it was a game. But Jim never laughed with them. He expected silence, he expected attention. And when he didn't get it, something in him changed. One afternoon, a boy interrupted one of his performances, laughing and throwing a stick into the stage. "Stop acting like a preacher," the boy said. "It's just pretend." For a moment, Jim didn't move. He just stared. Then his voice dropped. "You shouldn't mock God." The boy shrugged. "We're just playing, Jim." Jim stepped closer, his expression completely still. "No," he said quietly. "This isn't a game." The air shifted. The laughter faded. Even the other children stopped smiling. Something about the way he spoke made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. Years later, those who knew him would remember small moments like this, not because they were dramatic at the time, but because they felt wrong in hindsight, like something hidden was already forming underneath the surface. Because Jim Jones wasn't just pretending to preach, he was studying how people followed, and more importantly, why they followed. He noticed how people leaned in when someone spoke with confidence, how silence could make a room uncomfortable, how fear could quiet a crowd faster than logic ever could, how belief could spread when it was spoken with certainty. At home, he grew increasingly isolated. He would speak to himself for hours, rehearsing sermons in empty rooms. Sometimes, his mother would find him standing still, staring at nothing, as if addressing an invisible audience. "Jim," she would say carefully, "who are you talking to?" He would turn slowly and reply, "People need to hear me." His mother frowned. "What people?" Jim would pause. "Everyone." As he grew older, his obsession only deepened. Religion wasn't just faith to him. It became structure, influence, authority. He wasn't drawn to God in the traditional sense. He was drawn to the idea of being believed without question. One teacher once described him as a boy who always wanted to lead, even when there was nothing to lead. And that was the beginning of it. Not violence, not tragedy, but something more subtle. A desire to be seen, to be followed, to be obeyed. By the time Jim Jones reached adolescence, the world around him was still struggling through poverty and uncertainty, but inside him, something far more specific had already taken shape. He didn't just want attention anymore. He wanted influence. He wanted devotion. And eventually, without fully understanding where it would lead, he wanted something far more dangerous than either. He wanted control. And once that idea took root in his mind, it never left. Chapter 2. Building the Perfect Church. By the 1950s, Jim Jones had become a charismatic young preacher. America was changing. Racial tensions were high, segregation remained common, and many churches were still divided by race. Jones saw something others did not, a door opening inside the chaos of a divided country. He stepped forward and began preaching a message that sounded almost revolutionary for its time. Unity, equality, justice. In his early sermons, Jones welcomed black and white members into the same congregation when many churches refused to do so. It made people stop and listen. Some admired him, others hated him, but no one ignored him, and that attention became momentum. The church grew and became known as the People's Temple. At first, it felt like something rare, almost sacred. Members described it as a place where they finally felt seen, a community built on compassion, acceptance, and change. One woman attending her first service later recalled sitting in silence as Jim Jones stepped onto the stage. His voice filled the room. "We are building a family," he declared, "a place where everyone belongs." The congregation erupted in applause. Some people stood, some cried, others simply smiled, as if they had finally found something they had been searching for their entire lives. Hope is powerful, especially for people who feel forgotten, and Jim Jones understood that better than anyone. After one service, a young couple approached him near the exit. The husband hesitated before speaking. "This church feels different," he said. Jones smiled warmly, almost gently. "That's because we're building a better world," he replied. The words felt simple, safe, certain. The couple joined that same week. So did many others. But beneath the surface of growing crowds and emotional sermons, something quieter was forming. Jones wasn't just building a church. He was building dependence. At first, it looked like care. Members were encouraged to spend more time together, to rely on the church community, to trust leadership for guidance in daily life. But slowly, that dependence deepened. Decisions that once belonged to individuals began shifting toward the group. Questions were answered with certainty instead of discussion. Doubt was softened into guilt. And the more people gave, the harder it became to pull away. Because leaving didn't feel like walking away from a church anymore. It felt like abandoning a family. And Jim Jones knew exactly what he was doing. He spoke more often about sacrifice, about loyalty, about commitment to something greater than yourself. One evening after a service, a member quietly asked him, "Pastor, how far are we supposed to go for this movement?" Jones looked at him for a long moment before answering. "As far as it takes," he said. The member nodded slowly, uncertain, but comforted by the confidence in his voice. That confidence was the key. People didn't just believe Jim Jones. They began to trust that he knew better than they did. And as the People's Temple grew, so did his influence over every part of their lives, what they believed, how they lived, and eventually what they were willing to give up. At the time, it still looked like a church. But in hindsight, something far more complicated was taking shape. Because every sermon added another layer, every promise deepened the bond, every act of trust made it harder to turn back, and Jim Jones was only just beginning. Chapter 3: Miracles, Lies, and Devotion. As the People's Temple expanded, Jim Jones became increasingly influential. His sermons grew larger, his audience grew larger, and slowly his ego grew larger than either. What had once been presented as a message of unity was now becoming something far more intense, something charged with emotion, certainty, and absolute authority. Jones began claiming things that pushed the limits of belief. He said he could perform miracles, heal sickness, predict events before they happened, read the hidden thoughts of those in the room. And people listened, because by then, many no longer came just for sermons, they came for experiences. One evening during a packed service, the air inside the hall felt heavy with anticipation. Hundreds of people sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting as Jim Jones slowly stepped forward onto the stage. His eyes scanned the crowd as if searching for something only he could see. Then he stopped. He pointed directly at a woman in the audience. "You've been suffering from pain," he said. The woman froze. Her hands trembled slightly. "Yes," she whispered, just loud enough to be heard. The room went completely silent. Jones held his hand out toward her, his voice steady, deliberate. "You are healed." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the woman gasped. She pressed a hand to her body, blinking rapidly, as if something had shifted inside her. Tears filled her eyes. "It's gone," she said. The silence broke instantly. The crowd erupted. Applause, shouts, people rising to their feet, some crying openly, some praying, some trembling in what they believed was awe. To them, it wasn't just a moment. It was proof. Proof that Jim Jones was not an ordinary man. Proof that something greater moved through him. But behind the curtain of belief, a different truth would later emerge. Former members described a far more controlled reality. Information about attendees was quietly gathered before services. Personal struggles were known in advance. Conditions were sometimes exaggerated or already understood through careful observation. The miracles were not spontaneous at all, but carefully constructed performances designed to feel spontaneous. But by the time questions began to surface, most people no longer wanted answers, because belief had already become something deeper than faith. It had become identity. And once people invest enough of their lives into a belief, stepping away no longer feels simple. It feels like loss, like betrayal, like tearing apart the very structure of their world. Questioning becomes painful, doubt becomes dangerous, and leaving becomes unthinkable. Jim Jones understood this better than anyone in the room. He didn't just ask people to believe, he created a system where belief became easier than truth, and where truth itself felt like betrayal. And as devotion deepened, so did control. Quietly, patiently, step by step, until faith was no longer just something people practiced. It was something they surrendered to. Chapter 4: The Move to the Jungle. By the 1970s, the image of the People's Temple began to fracture. On the outside, it still looked like a growing movement, but cracks were forming beneath the surface. Journalists had started investigating. Former members were speaking out. And the stories they told were no longer about hope or unity. They were about control, allegations of abuse, psychological manipulation, punishments for disobedience, financial exploitation, fear used as discipline. The kind of accusations that, once spoken aloud, could not be ignored. And Jim Jones felt the pressure tightening around him. At first, he dismissed it publicly, but privately, something inside him began to change. "They're lying," he told one of his close aides late one night, pacing slowly across his office. "All of them." The aide hesitated. "Pastor?" What if more people come forward? Jones stopped walking. Then we stop them, he said quietly. The room went still. Because everyone understood what he meant without him having to explain it. Jones became increasingly paranoid. He believed enemies were everywhere, government agencies, the media, even former followers. Anyone who questioned him was no longer seen as confused or disillusioned. They were seen as threats, and threats had to be removed. One night during a private meeting, Jones leaned forward toward his inner circle. "They're watching us," he said. A follower nervously replied, "Who is Jim?" Jones didn't hesitate. "All of them." He straightened his posture. "We need to leave, now, before they take everything." Someone asked carefully, "Leave where?" Jones paused for a moment, then spoke with certainty. "Somewhere. They can't reach us." That place became Guyana. Deep in South America, hidden within dense jungle, far from cities, far from journalists, far from oversight. It was remote enough to disappear, and that was exactly what Jones wanted. To the outside world, he presented it as something extraordinary. A vision of paradise, a utopia, a new beginning. He called it Jonestown. One evening, standing before a large gathering of his followers, Jones spoke with passion, his voice echoing through the hall. "We are creating heaven on earth," he declared. The crowd erupted into applause. "We will build a community free from hatred, free from injustice, free from the world that has failed us." More applause followed. Some people stood. Some cried. Others held hands, moved by the promise of something better than what they had known. And most importantly, Jones continued, raising his voice slightly, "We will finally be safe." A woman in the crowd turned to her husband and whispered, "Do you think this is real?" Her husband looked at the stage. Jones was watching them. He forced a smile. "It has to be," the husband whispered back. "He wouldn't lead us wrong." And so they believed him. Families sold their homes. People quit their jobs. Entire lives were packed into suitcases and left behind. They followed him across borders, across oceans, and into the heart of the jungle. But what they didn't realize was that leaving would become the easiest part of the journey. Because once Jonestown was built, there would be no easy way out. And no one was prepared for what life inside it would become. Chapter 5. Paradise Becomes a Prison. The reality of Jonestown was far different from the dream. What had been sold as paradise quickly revealed itself as something harsher, heavier, and far more suffocating. The jungle itself was unforgiving. Heat clung to the skin like a second layer. Humidity made every breath feel thick. Exhaustion never fully left the body. Disease spread quietly through the settlement. Food was limited. Water was controlled, and every day blurred into the next under endless labor. Members worked constantly. They woke early. They worked in the fields. They built structures. They followed orders. They worked until their bodies gave out, and even then, rest was never guaranteed. Sleep became shallow. Privacy disappeared. Personal space vanished entirely. And so did freedom. From loudspeakers mounted across the settlement, Jim Jones's voice became a constant presence. It echoed through the jungle at all hours, sometimes calm, sometimes angry, sometimes strangely distant. "Stay alert," his voice would boom. "The outside world is watching. They want to destroy what we built. Do not trust doubt. Doubt is betrayal." There was no silence anymore. Only instruction, only warning, only control. Fear wasn't an occasional emotion inside Jonestown. It was the atmosphere itself. One night, as most of the settlement tried to rest, two exhausted members sat outside a wooden structure, speaking in whispers. "I want to leave," one of them said quietly. The other immediately tensed. "Don't say that," he replied, eyes scanning the darkness. "Why?" the first asked. "We're all thinking it." The second shook his head. "Someone might hear you." A long silence followed, broken only by insects in the jungle. The first member lowered his voice even further. "This isn't what we were promised." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the second answered almost reluctantly. "No," he said, "it isn't." Inside Jonestown, even thoughts felt dangerous. People learned to measure their words carefully, to look over their shoulders before speaking, to hide doubt behind forced expressions of agreement. Trust eroded quietly, replaced by suspicion, because no one knew who was listening. And in many cases, they were right to be afraid. Armed guards moved through the settlement under strict instruction. Communication with the outside world was heavily restricted. Passports had been taken early on, quietly and without resistance from most members. Letters were monitored. Phone calls were controlled. Even private conversations felt unsafe. The promise of a free society had slowly transformed into something else entirely. A sealed world, a controlled environment, a place where leaving was no longer a simple decision, but a near impossibility. And as the days passed, more members began to realize a terrifying truth they could no longer ignore. They were not building a utopia. They were living inside one man's absolute control. And that man was becoming more unpredictable with every passing day. Chapter 6. The Congressman. By November 1978, the outside world could no longer ignore Jonestown. Reports from defectors had become too disturbing, too consistent, too detailed to dismiss. Families were demanding answers. Government officials were under pressure. Something was happening deep in the Guyanese jungle, and no one knew exactly how far it had gone. So a decision was made. A delegation would go. At the center of it was American Congressman Leo Ryan, a man determined to see Jonestown with his own eyes. He didn't fully know what to expect, only that too many questions remained unanswered. When Ryan and his team arrived at the settlement, they were met with something carefully staged: smiles, handshakes, guided tours, organized presentations. Jim Jones personally welcomed them. "Congressman," Jones said warmly, extending his hand, "we are honored you are here." Ryan studied him for a moment before shaking his hand. "I just want to see the truth," he replied. Jones smiled. "Then you will." For the first hours, everything appeared controlled, even peaceful. Members of Jonestown were brought forward to speak. Some praised the community, some described happiness, some insisted they were free. But the illusion didn't hold for long. Outside the staged events, something different was happening. People began slipping away from supervision, approaching Ryan in silence, passing folded notes, whispering urgently. One woman stood close enough to speak without being noticed and pressed a small piece of paper into a visitor's hand. Her fingers were shaking. "Please," she whispered, eyes wide, "get us out of here." Another man approached later, pretending to adjust equipment. His voice was barely audible. "They won't let us leave," he said. "You have to help us." The notes multiplied. The requests became impossible to ignore, and slowly the truth began to surface in fragments. Jonestown was not what it appeared to be, not even close. Ryan's expression changed as he read the messages. He tried to remain calm, but the situation was becoming clear. And Jim Jones noticed. Inside the settlement, tension spread quickly. Jones's inner circle became alert. Movement slowed, conversations quieted, people began watching one another more closely, because now there was a real possibility of collapse. If even a small number of people left, everything could unravel. That night, Jones spoke privately to his aides. "He's taking them," he said. One of them replied cautiously, "Congressman Ryan?" Jones nodded sharply. "He's taking them away from us." His voice lowered. "We cannot allow that." The air in the room changed instantly, not because anything had happened yet, but because everyone understood what was coming. Something had shifted, and Jonestown would never feel stable again. Chapter 7. The Final Order. On November 18, 1978, everything broke. The visit had turned into evacuation. Several members had chosen to leave with Congressman Ryan. Tension had reached a breaking point, and the carefully controlled world Jim Jones had built was slipping through his hands. At the airstrip, confusion turned into violence in a matter of moments. Gunfire erupted. Panic spread. The congressman and several others were attacked and killed as chaos overtook the scene. Back in Jonestown, no one fully understood what had happened, only that something irreversible had begun. Later that day, Jim Jones gathered the community. The loudspeakers crackled. His voice echoed across the settlement. "The world is coming for us," he said. Silence followed. People looked at each other, unsure, afraid, exhausted. Some began crying. Others simply stared forward, numb. Jones continued, "We have no future." A murmur spread through the crowd. A woman stood up suddenly. "We don't have to do this," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "We can leave. We can still leave." For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Jones responded sharply, "Leave to where?" No one answered. Voices began rising. Arguments broke out. Fear, confusion, disbelief, all colliding at once in a single suffocating moment. But years of control had already done their work. For many, the idea of escape no longer felt real. The outside world felt distant, unfamiliar, almost impossible to return to. And then came the order, the final order. Containers were brought forward. A mixture was prepared. Guards moved through the crowd. Parents were instructed to begin with their children. At first there was confusion, then realization, then panic. "No, please, no," a mother cried, pulling her child closer. "Jim, stop this!" someone shouted. But the system had already been set in motion. Crying filled the air. Screaming followed. People tried to resist, tried to flee, tried to understand what was happening. But the collapse of control was already complete. What followed became one of the darkest scenes in modern history. Not just because of the number of lives lost, but because of how quickly hope turned into horror, and how a community that once believed it was building paradise ended in unimaginable tragedy. Chapter 8. The Silence After. When investigators finally arrived, they were met with a scene that defied comprehension. The jungle was still, unnaturally still. No shouting, no movement, no life in the way they expected life to exist in a place meant for hundreds of people. Bodies lay scattered across the settlement. Some were inside buildings, some outside in the open air. Families were found together, holding each other in their final moments. Children lay beside parents, friends beside friends, entire lives reduced to silence in a single afternoon. More than 900 people were dead, including hundreds of children. And at the center of it all was Jim Jones, the man who promised paradise, the man who promised protection, the man who promised a better world. He was gone too, but what remained behind was not closure. It was questions. How could something like this happen? How could so many people, intelligent, educated, caring people, follow one man so completely into isolation, fear, and ultimately destruction? There are no simple answers, because the people of Jonestown were not foolish. They were not mindless. Many of them were idealistic, searching for something the outside world had failed to give them. community, equality, purpose, a place where they felt they belonged. And that is what makes the story so unsettling, because the tragedy did not begin with violence. It began with trust, one conversation at a time, one promise at a time, one compromise at a time, until slowly, almost invisibly, belief became obedience, and obedience became surrender. One former member later said quietly, "It didn't happen all at once. It happened little by little. And by the time we realized it, it was already too late." The lesson of Jonestown is not just about one man or one movement. It is about how easily hope can be shaped, how easily fear can be introduced into belief, and how easily a group of people seeking a better world can be led away from it. Because power without accountability can grow unchecked, isolation can become control, and devotion can become dangerous when it is no longer questioned. In the end, Jonestown stands as one of the darkest warnings in modern history, not because it began with violence, but because it began with something far more ordinary, a voice saying, "Follow me," and people who believed they finally had a place to go, never realizing where the path would end